Barry Fitzgerald, have you ever heard of the show Ghost Hunters?
Yeah, I've heard of the show.
He wants to know, why do you think aliens are here?
Well, in one of my books, I talk about 20 reasons for coming here, but I think, they're graduate students doing their thesis research on the development of a primitive society. They're radio broadcasters with the weekly show, Idiocy in the Boondocks. They're stealing our heavy minerals. The Earth is the densest planet in the solar system. That means a cubic foot of Earth weighs more than a cubic foot of any of the other planets. That means there are more heavy metals, which are rare in the universe.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Some have weird properties, like uranium 100 years ago was used for a yellow coloring agent for tableware. That's illegal now, of course.
Yes.
But I think the primary reason is to quarantine us.
Right.
We're a primitive society whose major activity is obviously tribal warfare. World War II, we killed 50 million of our own kind.
Yeah, that's just
people.
Insane.
We destroyed 1,700 cities. We have exploded. People think we've only exploded, the bombs on Japan, nuclear weapons. We've exploded a total of 2,000 nuclear weapons, even though only 2 of them on people.
Right. The rest were just tests, right?
Tests, yeah. Some of them were even underground. What do you know? We have joined the nuclear club. That is, we know, as all the advanced civilizations do, that the primary source of energy in the universe is nuclear fusion in the stars.
Right.
That's what drives the sun. We didn't know that until the late 30s. I worked on a study in 1962 of use of nuclear fusion for deep space travel. It was for the Air Force, as a matter of fact. You can kick particles out the back end of a fusion rocket that will have 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in a dumb old chemical rocket. There's a little money involved. If you want to go, you got to put out the dough. That's the way it is. So don't be misled by the fact that we haven't done it yet.
Do you think that maybe that, I can't remember the name of the particle, but it's basically the God particle. Do you think that could help out in as far as propulsion?
Not that I know of. No. Fusion we know something about. We have exploded. Well, to give you an example of the difference it makes if you go nuclear, a big bomb in 1944, the year before the war ended, was a 10-ton blockbuster. It released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite, made a big hole in the ground, too. Now, our first atomic bomb, the next year, 45, released the energy of about 15,000 tons of dynamite.
That's insane.
The first H-bomb released the energy of 10 million tons of TNT. And the Russian set one off that was 50 million tons of TNT.
Did they have any clue of what it might do to our atmosphere and our air and our water?
Well, it made a mess in a place in Siberia. Who cares? What can I say?
Yeah. Okay, now let's see.
What I'm saying is, from an alien viewpoint, though, all these nuclear weapons leave radioactive materials in the atmosphere. They can very quickly see what kind of a civilization we have.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, the total military budget this past year was $1 trillion. This is for planet Earth.
Right.
And 20,000 kids died of starvation yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. So we're not nice guys.
Kind of like the bad guys now with the kind of weapons, the primitive but deadly weapons we're coming up with. So that makes total sense to me as well.
And they don't want to be surprise attacked by us, exactly, as you can imagine.
Okay, now that kind of brings up another one about what do you think about teleportation?
Well, it would be nice if I knew how to do it, but I don't know how to do it. I know about security, and you don't lie if you can help it, but you be evasive. So,
do you think that there are people tinkering with it at least?
Well, the Russians did experiments in a lab with moving stuff around with mines back in the late 40s.
Right.
So that's not the same as moving people a long distance at a high speed.
No, but it's still along that lines. Yeah, okay. Oh, okay. Is there any footage or pictures that you have seen that you are flat out convinced this is real?
Oh, sure. I use them, and I don't mean lights in the sky. I don't know what the heck to do with them.
Right.
The McMinnville, Oregon photograph, Paul Trent's from the 1950s. As a matter of fact, they have an annual festival and I'll be there in May. These are all listed on my website, www.stantonfriedman.com, events. 2 pictures there. Dr. Bruce Maccabee published articles in scientific journals about those.
Right.
And they're legitimate. The Santa Ana, California, Rex Heflin photo is legitimate. There are a number of items that will do okay. Obviously, we don't have the pictures taken by gun cameras on board airplanes,
right,
which would be much better. You know, when you get close to your subject, when you take a picture, you get a bigger picture.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah, there are pictures, but I should point out that contrary to people's expectation, your typical digital camera isn't a great scientific tool. The resolution is not very good.
No.
I mean, if you get 40 megapixels, you're getting better, but most are 10, 12, 15, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also, you know, the moon in the sky can be covered by an aspirin tablet held at arm's length. Be evasive. That's not very big.
No.
And yet we think of it as being quite large when we see it. Wow. When I ask people, usually was what they saw as big as the moon. Usually it's no. So that's a small chunk of the sky.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, now I got a friend named Lincoln Levere, who's a local boy that now lives in Tombstone, Arizona. He's an actor. He was in The Postman with Kevin Costner and such. And he wants to know, and he'd like to know, if you could go back in time knowing what you know now, would you do anything different, and would you try to get yourself a souvenir?
Well, I never saw a UFO, so I don't know how to get myself a souvenir.
Oh, even just with people you talked to that said they may have had one. Well, remember, you'd have hindsight now, so you'd know where to go to get these souvenirs.
Well, look, I worked under security for 14 years. The government knows how to keep secrets, be evasive. And big ones and small ones. I mean, I'll give you an example. The Brits broke the German military communications code. In World War II, there were 12,000 people working in Bletchley Park, a small English community, and their job was to intercept, decode, translate, and very carefully deliver appropriate materials to appropriate people with an appropriate need to know. Well, if the Germans found out we'd broken the code, they'd have changed it, you see, definitely. And we couldn't afford that because it was so extraordinarily important to saving lives. And as a matter of fact, we were able to, we fooled Hitler with disinformation, convincing him that the invasion of Europe, which everybody knew was coming, would be at Calais instead of at Normandy.
I remember seeing that. Didn't they have, they made like inflatable, like fake tanks and stuff?
Oh, they did all kinds of stuff.
That
and they sent messages and stuff. And the point is, when the German generals said, bring in the reserves, Hitler said, no, that's not where the attack's going to stay. That's just a feint, F-E-I-N-T, and they're coming at Calais.
Right.
And he delayed, and thank goodness he did. But the fact that the German codes and also the Japanese codes had been broken was not made public just at the end of the war, but for 25 years later.
Wow.
It was kept secret, even though 12,000 people knew about it right at Bletchley Park. And I should stress, an important thing about security is need to know. Not all generals, for example, during the war got access to the super secret German communication.
Exactly. There were actually some majors and such that knew things the generals didn't.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it had nothing to do with rank. It was need to know.
Yeah.
And, you know, I get people telling me that the guys who worked on Majestic 12 would have certainly told their wives what they were doing. That's nonsense. I never told my wife anything classified.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, it's a good example of that. The man who was in charge of the Manhattan Project to build nuclear weapons in the United States during World War II, General Leslie Groves, his wife got a call on August 6, 1945, from somebody in his office at the Pentagon, telling her he thought she would be interested in listening to the news today at noon. She turns on the radio, no television back then, and they announced the bombing of Hiroshima, this incredible new weapon, and that the war would probably be over soon. And She thought he took the officer from her husband's office, told her about it, because their son was due to be sent to the Pacific.
Right.
The last sentence of the program was this project to develop these incredible nuclear weapons was done under the direction of General Leslie Groves. That's when she found out what her husband had been doing for the previous 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
And he did a lot of traveling, met with all kinds of people. He didn't tell her anything. Well, I say that only to illustrate, and as part of the Manhattan Project, we're not talking just a few bucks here and there. To separate uranium isotopes, uranium-235 is nicely used in a nuclear weapon. U-238's a pain in the butt. There's 0.7% U-235, so you got to enrich the uranium. How do you do that? Well, our solution was to build a plant, a gaseous diffusion plant, that was 1 mile long. It had sheets of nickel through which you pumped uranium hexafluoride gas, and you keep running it through. The lighter isotope moves a little quicker, and we were using, at that facility, 5% of all the electricity produced in the United States.
Holy cow.
In secret. That's why it was at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, because TVA had dams and was producing lots of electrical power. But it was all done in secret, and many of the people working on the project had no idea what they were working on.
Right.
So secrets can be kept. That's the way it is, and not only in the United States, but in Russia and China and so on.
But every country has their patriots that believe that they have to keep these secrets, and if the person who ordered them knows what they're doing, and yeah, so I mean that makes sense too. Since we're talking about these kind of experiments, what's your thoughts about the Philadelphia experiment?
A total baloney.
Yeah, okay.
And sell it from a delicatessen. Secrets can be kept.
It is a pretty fantastic story. I'd love for it to be true. I mean, aside from what the soldiers went through, if it did.
Yeah, we did a lot of checking on that many years ago, and there were a lot of liars. Even today, there's plenty of phony baloney stuff that gets spread all the time. I see it on television from time to time,
right.
as if it were true.
Okay, so since we're talking about that, Jim Mount from Toronto would like to know, do you believe Bob Lazar's story?
Maybe he knows that I don't, but when I first heard about that, because the claim was that Bob was a nuclear physicist, so people kept asking me about him, because I'm a nuclear physicist. And so I started to try to check. In particular, Bob said he had a master's degree in physics from the MIT and another one in electronics from Caltech. Mm-hmm. Now, those are the two top technical scientific institutions in the country, certainly among the best in the world.
Right.
And so I checked with 5 different people at MIT. They never heard of him. Same happened at Caltech. And I talked to Bob's high school. He finished in the bottom third of his high school class. Wow. He never would have been accepted at MIT. I got a call from his buddy asking what would it take to convince me. I said, how about copies of his diplomas? And several other things like that, listings and directories of, if you get a degree from MIT, you don't throw it away.
Right.
I was accepted there. I couldn't afford to go. Tuition was $950 a year. Now it's $27,000 something.
Yeah, I know. Wow. Eh?
So the answer, and also he claimed that Los Alamos had 500 pounds of element 115. Wow.
Right.
In the first place, it's got a short half-life, less than 2 minutes, so there's no way you can accumulate 500 pounds of it. In the second place, yes, it's real, and we anticipated. We ran that big accelerator. There was a joint program with the Soviets, and we found 4 atoms of the stuff, which is exciting from a physics viewpoint, but you need 10 followed by 23 zeros, more atoms than that to do anything.
Right, okay.
So it sounds good, but it ain't true.
Billy Lawton from Romford, Maine wants to know, do you believe disclosure will happen soon, and what do you think it'll take to make everyone believe?
Well, most people already accept reality. The problem is that most people think most other people don't, so they're afraid to talk about it. When I, at the end of my lectures, ask how many people believe that they have seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer.
You're pretty much right. I think you pretty much answered that. Most people do believe But a lot of other people, it's just because they're afraid of like stigma and speaking out and that kind
Well,
of
yeah, when the polls show that, and I've had classrooms where 80% thought most people didn't believe in UFOs, and 80% of those kids did. And when I ask about the sightings, 10% raised their hand. When I ask how many of you reported what you saw, 90% put their hands down.
Yeah. Okay, Stan Lee from Houston, Texas. I don't know if it's the Stan Lee or not, but he wants to know, I found this pretty funny, and we can actually put a spin on it. Are humans real?
Well, real what? Not very intelligent, I'd say.
Well, the spin I would like to put on that be like, there's a lot of theories out there that at some point our natural evolution was interrupted, and they think that UFOs and aliens may have come down and spliced our DNA.
Well, I'm not saying we're not somebody's colony. Maybe a penal colony. They dumped all the bad boys and girls here, and that's why we're so nasty to each other.
I think it's a combination, penal colony, and we're a TV show for them, yes. All right, if you could sit at a table with anyone living or dead and talk about UFOs and physics, who would it be?
Oh, boy. The first names that come to mind are people who are dead, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I don't know. Probably not Stephen Hawking.
No.
And not many of the ancient academics and fossilized physicists of the world seem to feel that they can express an opinion without doing any homework at all. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up.
Yeah.
Well, for example, Dr. Tyson, Neil deGrasse Tyson, head of the Hayden Planetarium in New York. Mm-hmm. He was the one who redid the Cosmos series.
Right, that's right. I just started
When he spoke at Penn State University, he said, the proof that governments can't keep secrets is how much we know about President Clinton's genitalia. Now, there's a clever remark. He doesn't know anything about security, obviously.
Yeah. Did you ever get the chance to talk to any of the astronauts like Edgar Mitchell?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I have. I've talked to, Dr. Edgar Mitchell wrote the foreword for my book, Flying Saucers and Science.
Right.
He was the sixth man to walk on the moon. So.
Yeah, and he's from Roswell, correct?
Well, he lived there growing up. Also, an astronaut on the first craft that went around the moon but didn't land. He and I were each chairing a session at a meeting of the American Nuclear Society, and we had known each other before that, and we spent 2 hours talking about UFOs, and he bought copies of everything I had with me. I was giving a lecture on the way home from there. I was working for Westinghouse. And I asked him about the astronauts' sightings, because I'd heard about them, and, well, he didn't think there was anything that couldn't be explained after investigation. But he said it in such a way that I really thought that I had hit a security wall, and I wasn't going to push it. Be evasive. Well, I know about security, and you don't lie if you can help it, but you be evasive, I'll put it that way. Mm-hmm. And I've talked to a couple of other astronauts. One was at the congressional hearings in 1978. He gave testimony about a sighting he'd had when he was a pilot in Europe in the 50s. Wow. The astronauts are definitely interested. I've spoken at NASA Houston. Very good response. So, look, I've spoken to engineering societies, management clubs for people like Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas and stuff like that. They're all interested. It's weird that people think that these people don't care.
What do you think of ancient alien theory?
Well, it depends on how you define it. Do I think that there have been past visitations? Yes, of course. Anybody who wants to read some good examples of that, look at Dr. Barry Downing's book on flying saucers in the Bible.
Right.
He goes through the Old and New Testaments and finds many examples. I mean, of course, they didn't use saucers back then, only cups or mugs. But
fire and stuff like that was what they would call them, yeah.
Yeah, but, Ezekiel's wheel, the pillar of fire by night, the cloud by day. There are a whole bunch of these. And, of course, there's all that Renaissance artwork with things in the sky, and you say, where the heck did that, what's that doing there,
What do you think about the Bermuda Triangle? Do you think that's a legitimate phenomenon?
There are ships that go down and planes that go down in that region of the water. Of course, this is true in many other places.
Right.
Secrets can be kept, and what we know is that there are an awful lot of people who go out on boats who aren't well prepared. They have a shallow road map from Florida, and take their boat out. And the weather is subject to rapid changes in that area. Be evasive and may well be responsible for all kinds of crazy things happening. So, sightings occur all over the world. I'm more concerned about between 1951 and 56, 200 American military planes had fatal crashes.
Right.
And 5 of the pilots had over 100 missions in Korea where they had to be pretty good pilots because there were MiGs trying to shoot them down.
Mm-hmm.
They come back to the United States where there weren't any MiGs, and they crash. And the New York Times used words like disintegrated and disappeared.
Wow.
And I have, on 7 different occasions, had people come up to me quietly after my lectures and tell me that they were stationed at a certain base where a pilot was scrambled to chase a UFO and never came back. If I've heard 7 stories, I got to be a lot more than that. Well, orders were actually issued in 1952. Shoot them down if they don't land when instructed to do so. You can see a lot of good cartoons with that.
Yeah. Okay. And do you think that Germany had any crashes that Hitler may have been able to get his hands on?
I don't think so.
No. I would think not either, because a lot of
He would
people...
have used it if he could figure out how they work.
You would think he would have used it, yeah.
Well, he was such a nice guy, he didn't want to hurt anybody.
Apparently he was an animal lover, like that's supposed to make up for anything.
Oh.
A couple of names. There was actually, the last time I talked to you, I had brought up Nick Pope, and you had mentioned that he's a nice guy, but you don't like the way he's a little hard on one of the guys from the Rendlesham case. Could you get into that a little bit more about Rendlesham and what you were? Who is it you think he's picking on?
The guy, I'm picturing him in my mind, and the name isn't coming, but it'll come. He wrote a book with Larry Warren, Left at Eastgate, and he's from New York State. And Nick and he have differences of opinion, let's put it that way. They each have competing books.
Right, okay.
And Nick's a sharp guy. He worked for the Ministry of Defense in England, their UFO desk for like 3 years. And the problem you get into is that, judging by the United States anyway, most of the people involved in like Project Blue Book, which was supposedly the American establishment to deal with UFOs, and when it was closed, that ended everything. Mm-hmm. That sounds good, but you get Blue Book files, there's nothing above secret in them. And then we finally got a memo from the man whose memo closed Project Blue Book, General Carol Bolender, wrote the memo in October 1968. 69, I'm sorry. It was because of the University of Colorado study done, the Condon report at University of Colorado.
Right.
They recommended the Blue Book be closed because it wasn't contributing anything to intelligence or the military, which is true, frankly. Anyway, General Bolender, who was an engineer working on the Lunar Excursion Module program, was asked what should we do about Project Blue Book? So he wrote a memo, which we didn't see until 10 years later, in which he said that, moreover, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP, Joint Army Navy Air Force Publication 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system, which is an extraordinary statement. 2 paragraphs later, he said in this memo that if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have a place to report UFO sightings. However, as already noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures set up for that purpose. Again, an extraordinary claim. Now, we got this 10 years later. I managed to locate General Bolender. I like looking for people who don't have common names. Don't ask me to find John Smith. I'm in trouble, you know. And I talked to him on the phone. As far as I know, I'm the only one who has, and you can't now because he's dead. Or at least I don't know how to do that. And I said, it sounds to me like you're saying there are 2 separate channels of communication here. He said, yes. And I said, well, suppose a saucer goes down the runway at a Strategic Air Command base where nuclear weapons are stored. I said, I presume that's a report that could affect national security. By definition, you can't have people at places where nuclear weapons are stored. On the other hand, my wife and I go down the driveway and see a saucer flying by, that's no big deal, happens all the time. And he agreed. And this is important to Canada because Canada is joint ownership, if you will, with JNAP 146 and Air Force Manual 55-11. We have a joint Canadian-American Air Defense Command.
Okay.
And if pilots see something, there are instructions about what they should do. Now, obviously, I think reports which could affect national security are much more important to the government than ones that can't.
Right.
And as a further example of that, the National Security Agency, NSA, Mr. Snowden's group, and so forth.
I was going to mention him, too.
I know, that's what NSA stands for. Anyway, after court manipulations, we went through Freedom of Information and so forth, a group called Citizens Against UFO Secrecy. They finally, after much waiting, released 156 top-secret Umbra NSA UFO documents. The only trouble was that you could read one sentence per page.
Right. I saw
Everything
that.
else was whited out. You can get dozens of documents from the CIA, which are all blacked out. Sometimes you can read 6 words on a page. Wow.
Yeah, that's nuts. Well, yeah, and you know what? Since you brought up Mr. Snowden, what's your opinion on what he has to say?
Well, he hasn't said a lot about UFOs, and I can understand why he's staying out of the country, because he'd be put in the slammer immediately. He
And isn't that in itself
security.
insanity? I mean, yes, he... I understand you know that there's the need for security, but at least some of the things he brought up really did need to come out.
Well, I'm not saying that isn't true. Look, when I was working on radiation shielding for nuclear airplanes, the guy in charge of security I think he thought we'd find a magic paint, and you wouldn't have to add any shielding. You just put this on the reactor, and we'd all be protected.
Well,
so everything was
much
more classified than it had to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying, everything that's classified should be classified. I am saying there is a legitimate need for security,
Definitely.
and that, for example, people pushing disclosure with a capital D don't seem to be ready to understand that if the United States government have learned important new technology from Roswell wreckage or Aztec wreckage, or maybe even from monitoring with aircraft instrumentation, new ways of detecting stuff flying in the atmosphere. If we have learned such stuff, why in the world should we put it on the table if the Russians and Chinese don't put what they have learned on the table? I mean, we've been playing this game of weapon, counter-weapon, counter-weapon for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that there is a $1 trillion budget on the planet for things military tells you that there's a lot of investment in fancy technology to try to kill people.
Yeah, there's a lot of money to be made. And
you don't talk about it.
No.
And the penalties for breaking security are pretty severe. Death, life imprisonment, stuff like that. So that's the way the world is. So I don't think everything should be disclosed. I would be nice to see a statement made by, I like to talk about 2 highly trusted individuals around the world, the Queen of England and the Pope. How's that for an odd couple? What if they were to say that we have it on good authority that the planet's being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft? They are concerned about our activities, and there are going to be international meetings over the next few months dealing with the economic, religious, philosophical, and technological aspects of this. What would happen?
right.
I think church attendance would go up, mental hospital admissions would go up, the stock market would go down. But I think one of the key things that would happen is that the younger generation, which unlike me was never alive when there wasn't a space program, would immediately push for a new view of ourselves instead of as Canadians, Americans, Greeks, Peruvians, Chileans, whatever, as Earthlings.
Yeah.
And I don't know of any government on this planet, certainly not our Canadian government, that would like its citizens to owe their primary allegiance to the planet instead of that government.
Right.
Nationalism is the only game in town.
Mm-hmm.
So every government has a vested interest in staying in power. People in power want to stay in power. That goes with it's part of the game,
Yeah, it's all about control and wanting to stay there, and it is just silly. It would be very cool if they all could get together at the same table and go, hey, here's all the cards, to hell with it. This is what we should keep secret from civilians, at least be open with each other at the very least, and figure out what we can handle, what we can't, and get away from fossil fuels. That's my opinion on it. Anyway.
Well, I've done a debate on UFOs. It's available at my website, www.stantonfriedman.com. It's called Are Flying Saucers Real? Mm-hmm. And I did it with an retired Air Force pilot named Magaha at a university in Tennessee, Middle Tennessee State University. And there's a moderator. It's a 2-hour DVD, and you can decide who won.
Great talk. Time is flying by. Okay, so make sure, people, anyone listening, go to www.stantonfriedman.com events to check out what's going on. Conspiracy Factor Theory.
Secrets can be kept.